Between 1969 and 1978, in Cumberland County, North Carolina, 6 individuals died with identical symptoms. Violent stomach pain, uncontrollable vomiting, and an agonizing death within days was their fate. One innocent connection was shared by each victim, a soft-spoken, church-going grandmother named Velma Barfield, who was always nearby when tragedy struck, ready with a whispered prayer and a gentle touch. The deaths were explained as heart failure, gastroenteritis, or tragic accidents. In rural North Carolina, this was common enough that no one suspected the sweet grandmother who volunteered at church and cared for the elderly. But when 56-year-old Stuart Taylor collapsed during a Pentecostal revival meeting in 1978, his family refused to accept another mysterious death. Their demand for an autopsy would expose Velma Barfield as one of America's most cunning serial killers, making her the first woman in U.S. history to be executed by lethal injection. Before we continue with the story of the grandmother who turned caregiving into killing, be sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because a tale like this could have happened anywhere. The perfect cover for evil is created by trust and faith. It would be discovered by investigators that she had been using nothing more than common rat poison, administered with the precision of someone who had turned murder into an art form. The North Carolina of the 1960s and 70s was a world where communities were built on foundations of unshakable trust, where church attendance was not just expected but encouraged, and where the concept of a cold-blooded killer grandmother was literally inconceivable. In Cumberland County, particularly around small farming communities like Parkton and Fayetteville, everyone knew their neighbor's business. Safely in the streets, children played, and elderly folks never hesitated to invite helpful strangers into their homes. Parkton itself was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly. With fewer than 500 residents scattered among tobacco and cotton farms, it was a community where the Baptist Church served as both spiritual and social center, where crowds from 3 counties over were drawn to high school basketball games, and where a person's word was considered as binding as any legal contract. The landscape was dominated by red clay fields that stretched to pine-covered horizons, punctuated by modest farmhouses and the occasional general store that served as an unofficial community gathering place. Into this world of simple pleasures and traditional values, Margie Velma Bullard had been born on October 29, 1932, in nearby Eastover, South Carolina, but raised near Fayetteville as the oldest daughter and second child among 9 siblings. Her family worked a small tobacco and cotton farm, where life was hard but honest, where responsibility was learned early by children, and faith in God was as essential as the daily bread. Under strict Pentecostal Christian principles, the Bullard household operated with regular church attendance, daily prayers, and an unwavering belief in moral absolutes. Velma's childhood was marked by the kind of poverty that was common but not shameful in rural North Carolina. Their home lacked running water and electricity, luxuries that many families in the area couldn't afford. When nature called, the family would simply walk into the woods behind their property, a practice that was practical rather than primitive in an era when indoor plumbing was still considered a luxury for city folks. Despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them, the Bullard children learned the value of hard work, family loyalty, and community support. In elementary school, Velma proved to be a bright student who showed particular talent for reading and writing and excelled academically. Her quiet intelligence and helpful nature were noted by teachers. She was always willing to assist classmates who struggled with their lessons and never caused disciplinary problems. Consistently, her report cards showed high marks, and there seemed to be genuine potential for academic achievement despite the family's limited financial resources. As she entered her teenage years at Parkton Public School, a passion for basketball was discovered by Velma that surprised everyone, including herself. Despite not fitting the typical athletic build, she possessed quick reflexes and an understanding of game strategy that made her valuable to the girls' team. Basketball became her escape from the increasing responsibilities at home, a place where for a few precious hours each week, she could forget about household chores and family obligations. But short-lived was this brief taste of independence. When her mother Lily gave birth to twins, the family dynamics shifted dramatically. As the oldest daughter, Velma was expected to sacrifice her personal interests for family needs. Overwhelmed by the demands of caring for newborns while managing a household of 9 children, Lily insisted that Velma quit the basketball team to help with child care, cooking, and housework. For a young woman who had just discovered something she truly enjoyed and excelled at, the disappointment was crushing. It was during this period of adolescent frustration that Velma met Thomas Burke, a lanky, dark-haired boy, a year older, who possessed a gentle nature and a sense of humor that could make her laugh even during her darkest moments. Conventionally handsome, Thomas was not. He had angular features and prominent ears, but he treated Velma with a kindness and respect that was notably different from her father's harsh demeanor. Their courtship was conducted entirely within the confines of school grounds, as Velma's father had strict rules about dating that wouldn't be relaxed until she turned 16. When Velma did reach that milestone birthday, her father arbitrarily decided that 16 was still too young for serious courtship, leaving the young couple frustrated and increasingly determined to find their own path forward. Their romance deepened. During stolen moments between classes and brief conversations after church services, where Thomas would often attend just to see her. The decision to elope came as much from desperation to escape her increasingly difficult home situation as from young love. At 17, Velma saw marriage to Thomas as her only realistic path to independence and a better life. On a quiet morning in 1949, they drove to a justice of the peace in a neighboring county and exchanged vows in a simple ceremony that would bind them together for the next 20 years. The newlyweds settled into a small house in Parkton that had once belonged to Velma's extended family, a modest dwelling that represented hope and new beginnings for the young couple. For the first time in her life, Velma had her own home to manage, her own decisions to make, and her own future to build. The early years of their marriage were marked by shared dreams of creating the kind of stable, loving family that both had longed for during their difficult childhoods and genuine happiness. The transformation of the Burke household from haven to hell began gradually in 1965 when Thomas suffered a devastating automobile accident that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both their lives. The collision, which occurred on a rain-slicked country road during Thomas's commute from his job at a local textile mill, left him with a severe concussion and injuries that would plague him for the remainder of his life. The immediate aftermath of the accident seemed manageable. Thomas recovered from his initial injuries and returned to work within a few weeks, determined to provide for his family despite the persistent headaches and dizzy spells that had become his constant companions. But as months passed, it became clear that the damage was more extensive and permanent than anyone had initially realized. The headaches were not merely uncomfortable, they were excruciating episodes that would leave Thomas writhing in agony, unable to function for hours or sometimes days at a time. The pain was so severe that he began missing work regularly, which eventually cost him his position at the textile mill. Without steady employment and facing mounting medical bills, the family's financial situation became increasingly precarious. Like many working-class men of his generation who lacked access to adequate medical care or pain management resources, Thomas turned to alcohol as his primary method of dealing with chronic suffering. What began as an occasional beer to take the edge off his pain gradually escalated into serious dependency as the months turned into years without improvement in his condition. For Velma, whose strict Pentecostal upbringing had taught her that alcohol consumption was among the gravest of sins, Thomas's drinking represented not just a spiritual crisis that threatened the very foundation of their marriage, but a personal failing. She began a campaign to control his drinking that grew increasingly desperate and invasive. She would search their home for hidden bottles, pour discovered liquor down the sink, and even enlist their children in monitoring their father's behavior. The once harmonious Burke household became a battlefield of explosive confrontations and silent resentment. Thomas, humiliated by his inability to work and in constant physical pain, felt betrayed by his wife's monitoring and increasingly controlling behavior. Velma, watching the man she had married dissolve into someone she barely recognized, felt abandoned and frightened about their family's future. The situation reached a crisis point when Velma made the drastic decision to have Thomas committed to Dorothea Dix Hospital in Raleigh for alcoholism treatment. This action, taken without Thomas's consent and involving local authorities, represented the ultimate betrayal in his mind. Though the treatment was successful in helping him achieve sobriety, it came at the cost of destroying whatever trust and affection had remained in their marriage. During Thomas's absence, Velma was forced to support the family through her job at a local mill, work that was physically demanding and emotionally exhausting. To cope with the stress of single parenthood, financial pressure, and uncertainty about her marriage's future, she began taking prescription tranquilizers. Her family doctor, Dr. James Henderson, initially prescribed Valium to help her sleep and manage anxiety, but as her tolerance built, she began seeking additional medications from multiple sources. When Thomas returned from Dorothea Dix, he was sober, but fundamentally changed, bitter, resentful, and emotionally distant from the family he had once cherished. The man who had possessed a gentle nature and infectious humor had been replaced by someone who seemed to blame Velma for his current circumstances and who made no effort to hide his contempt for her actions. The marriage that had begun with such hope and love had devolved into a cold war of mutual antagonism. They continued living under the same roof, but as virtual strangers who communicated primarily through arguments about money, the children, and Thomas's continued inability to maintain steady employment. On the night of April 4, 1969, this toxic situation reached its fatal conclusion. Thomas had been drinking heavily that evening, not enough to pass out, but sufficient to leave him groggy and disoriented. Velma, claiming she needed to run errands that couldn't wait until morning, made the unusual decision to take both children with her and leave the house during evening hours. This departure was highly irregular for several reasons. Velma rarely left home after dark, especially with both children, and the errands she claimed to be running were vague and unnecessary. Neighbors would later recall that she had seemed agitated and distracted in the days leading up to that night, as if wrestling with some momentous decision. When the family returned several hours later, they found their home engulfed in flames that had already consumed most of the structure. The Parkton Volunteer Fire Department responded quickly to the emergency call, but the blaze was too advanced for effective intervention. Firefighters focused their efforts on preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring properties while the Burke family watched their life's possessions turn to ash. Thomas Burke's body was found in a bedroom where the fire appeared to have originated. The medical examiner determined that he had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached him, a small mercy that spared him from the agony of burning alive. The scene investigation, conducted by Cumberland County Sheriff's deputies with limited training in fire forensics, concluded that Thomas had fallen asleep while smoking a cigarette. A tragically common cause of house fires in rural areas during that era. Velma's reaction to the tragedy appeared genuine and devastating. She wept inconsolably at the scene, had to be physically restrained from attempting to enter the burning house, and seemed completely broken by the loss of her husband and home. Her obvious grief was noted by neighbors and emergency responders, who immediately rallied to support the widow and her two children. The funeral service at Parkton Baptist Church was attended by virtually the entire community, with Velma playing the role of the devastated widow to perfection. She accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, spoke movingly about Thomas's struggles with alcohol and chronic pain, and expressed gratitude for the community's support during her family's darkest hour. But there were subtle details that didn't quite align with the narrative of a tragic accident. Several neighbors noticed that Velma had removed several valuable items from the house in the days before the fire, family photographs, important documents, and small pieces of jewelry that she claimed to be cleaning or repairing. The timing of her departure with the children, leaving Thomas alone and intoxicated, struck some as unusually convenient. Most significantly, just 3 months after Thomas's death, the vacant lot where their home had stood experienced a second fire when debris that had been left to smolder somehow reignited. This second blaze, though smaller than the first, was significant enough to trigger an insurance investigation that ultimately resulted in a substantial payout to Velma. The insurance money, combined with a modest life insurance policy on Thomas and community donations organized by their church, provided Velma with more financial security than she had ever possessed. For a woman who had been struggling to make ends meet just months earlier, widowhood had proven remarkably profitable. What the community couldn't know was that they had just witnessed the birth of one of North Carolina's most methodical serial killers. Velma had discovered that murder, when properly executed and convincingly explained, could solve multiple problems simultaneously while generating financial reward and sympathy. The sweet-faced grandmother had tasted blood, and she would soon develop an insatiable appetite for more. The months following Thomas Burke's death revealed a side of Velma that few in the community had ever suspected existed, while maintaining her public image as a grieving widow devoted to her children's welfare. A remarkable ability to attract and manipulate men who could provide the emotional stability and financial security she craved was demonstrated by her. Within 6 months of becoming a widow, Velma had begun a relationship with Jennings Barfield, a 43-year-old widower who owned considerable property in the area and maintained a comfortable income through farming and various business investments. Throughout Cumberland County, Jennings was known as a man of substance and integrity, someone who had successfully raised his own children after his first wife's death and who was considered one of the most eligible bachelors in their social circle. Their courtship moved with a speed that raised eyebrows among their mutual acquaintances. While it was not uncommon for widowed individuals to remarry relatively quickly in that era, particularly when children were involved, the intensity of Velma's pursuit of Jennings seemed almost predatory to those who observed it closely. She attended social functions where she knew he would be present, found excuses to visit his property with small gifts or offers to help with household tasks, and generally made herself indispensable to his daily routine. Jennings, for his part, was genuinely attracted to Velma's apparent devotion and domestic skills. She was an excellent cook, a meticulous housekeeper, and someone who seemed to understand the importance of creating a stable home environment for children. Her religious faith, demonstrated through regular church attendance and involvement in various charitable activities, aligned with his own values and suggested a moral foundation that he found appealing. They married in August 1970, just 16 months after Thomas's death, in a ceremony that was more elaborate than Velma's first wedding, but still appropriately modest for a widow's remarriage. The service was held at Jennings's church, with both sets of children serving as witnesses to their union. The community generally approved of the match, viewing it as a practical arrangement that would provide security for Velma's children while giving Jennings the domestic partnership and companionship he had been missing. The early months of their marriage appeared successful on the surface. Velma threw herself into the role of Jennings's wife with the same intensity she had brought to their courtship, managing his household with military precision and ensuring that his needs were anticipated and met before he even recognized them himself. She was particularly attentive to his business affairs, offering to help with bookkeeping and correspondence that he found tedious. But beneath this facade of domestic bliss, dangerous patterns were already emerging. Velma's prescription drug use, which had begun during the final years of her marriage to Thomas, continued to escalate despite her new circumstances. She was now taking a sophisticated cocktail of medications: Elavil for depression, Sinequin for anxiety, Tylenol with codeine for chronic pain she claimed to suffer, and Valium for sleep. Each drug was prescribed by different physicians in neighboring counties, making it difficult for any single doctor to recognize the extent of her dependency. The cost of maintaining this drug habit was substantial, far exceeding what her household allowance could reasonably cover. When Jennings questioned certain unexplained expenses, Velma initially explained them as necessary medical costs or emergency expenditures related to her children's needs. But as the amounts grew larger and more frequent, these explanations became increasingly implausible. The truth was that Velma had begun systematically stealing from Jennings's accounts, using her access to his financial records to forge checks and make unauthorized withdrawals. Her technique was sophisticated. She would write checks for amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic bank verification, space the transactions across multiple accounts to avoid detection, and carefully study Jennings's signature until she could reproduce it flawlessly. For several months, this system worked perfectly. Jennings was a trusting man who rarely scrutinized his bank statements closely, and when he did notice discrepancies, Velma was always ready with reasonable explanations about household expenses or business costs that he might have forgotten. Her tears and apparent distress at being questioned were particularly effective at ending such conversations before they could develop into serious investigations. The situation began to unravel in early 1971 when Jennings's banker, a cautious man named Harold Mitchell, who had handled the Barfield family's finances for decades, noticed patterns in the account activity that seemed inconsistent with Jennings's normally conservative spending habits. Mitchell made discreet inquiries with Jennings about several large withdrawals and check transactions, conversations that gradually revealed the extent of Velma's deception. The confrontation between Jennings and Velma was explosive and definitive. Unlike Thomas, who had been weakened by injury and alcoholism, Jennings was a strong-willed man who would not tolerate deception or theft from anyone, including his wife. He demanded full disclosure of her financial activities, threatened to involve law enforcement if necessary, and ultimately informed Velma that he was consulting with an attorney about divorce proceedings. For Velma, this crisis represented an existential threat. Divorce would mean public exposure of her crimes, likely criminal prosecution for forgery and theft, and complete loss of the financial security that Jennings's death could provide through life insurance and inheritance. More importantly, she had learned from Thomas's death that permanent solutions were often more effective than temporary compromises. On the evening of March 22, 1971, Jennings Barfield began experiencing severe stomach pain that came on suddenly during what had seemed like a normal dinner. The cramping was intense and localized in his upper abdomen, accompanied by nausea that quickly progressed to violent vomiting. Within hours, he was also experiencing chest pain that he initially attributed to muscle strain from retching. Velma immediately assumed the role of concerned wife, calling their family physician and helping Jennings to the hospital when his condition continued to deteriorate. Dr. Patterson, who had treated Jennings for minor ailments over the years, was puzzled by the sudden onset and severity of his symptoms. Blood tests revealed elevated white cell counts suggesting infection, but no specific pathogen could be identified. Despite medical intervention, Jennings's condition worsened throughout the night. The chest pain became excruciating. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and he began showing signs of cardiovascular distress. At 3:17 a.m. on March 23, 1971, Jennings Barfield died of what physicians diagnosed as acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a severe gastric infection. Velma's grief appeared genuine and overwhelming. She had to be sedated at the hospital and required assistance from family members to make funeral arrangements. The service was well attended, with Jennings's business associates and community members expressing sympathy for the widow who had endured the loss of two husbands in less than 2 years. The timing of Jennings's death was particularly tragic because it occurred just as he had been planning to expand his farming operations and had taken out additional life insurance to protect his investments. These policies, combined with his existing coverage and property holdings, left Velma significantly wealthier than she had ever been. Within weeks of Jennings's funeral, Velma had settled his estate, collected insurance payments, and begun making plans for her future. She purchased a modest home near her parents in Fayetteville and enrolled her children in new schools, claiming that she needed to be closer to family support during her period of grief and adjustment. What she had actually accomplished was the perfection of her method. Unlike Thomas's death, which had required staging an accidental fire and dealing with property destruction, Jennings's murder had appeared completely natural. The symptoms she had induced with carefully administered doses of arsenic-based rat poison perfectly mimicked acute gastroenteritis followed by heart failure, a progression that was medically plausible and required no external explanation. More importantly, she had learned to time her attacks with precision. The confrontation about her theft had occurred just days before Jennings's death, providing clear motivation for him to change his will or take legal action against her. By acting quickly and decisively, she had eliminated the threat while preserving her access to his wealth. Velma had evolved from an opportunistic killer who had eliminated an inconvenient husband into a calculating predator who understood exactly how to use murder as a solution to complex problems. The sweet grandmother had become a sophisticated serial killer, and she was just getting started. Moving back to Fayetteville placed Velma in close proximity to her aging parents, a situation that initially appeared to be motivated by genuine filial devotion, but would soon reveal itself as anything but coincidental. Her father, Murphy Bullard, was already in poor health, suffering from lung cancer that would eventually claim his life through natural progression, one of the few deaths in Velma's orbit that required no assistance from her. But her mother, Lillian Bullard, represented both an opportunity and a problem. At 74 years old, Lillian lived on a modest but adequate pension supplemented by savings she had accumulated through decades of careful financial management. She was also becoming increasingly dependent on Velma for help with daily tasks, bill paying, and general household management, a dependency that provided perfect cover for the systematic theft that Velma had by now refined into an art form. The pattern of their relationship quickly established itself. Velma would visit her mother daily, often bringing small gifts or prepared meals that demonstrated her devotion. During these visits, she would help Lillian organize her financial paperwork, balance her checkbook, and handle correspondence with banks and insurance companies. This assistance was genuinely appreciated by Lillian, who found the complexities of modern banking and bureaucracy increasingly difficult to navigate. What Lillian didn't realize was that her helpful daughter was using these opportunities to study her signature, memorize her account numbers, and identify the patterns of her financial transactions. Within months of returning to Fayetteville, Velma had begun forging checks on her mother's accounts and taking out small loans using Lillian's identity as collateral. The amounts were initially modest, $20 or $30 at a time, sums that could be explained as cash withdrawals for household expenses or medical needs. But as Velma's drug addiction continued to escalate, and her tolerance for the various medications increased, she required larger and more frequent infusions of cash to maintain her habit. By the summer of 1974, Velma was stealing hundreds of dollars monthly from her mother's accounts. She had also discovered that Lillian possessed several valuable insurance policies and savings bonds that could be liquidated in case of emergency. The temptation to access these larger pools of money was constant, but doing so would certainly be detected and would raise questions that Velma couldn't answer convincingly. It was during this period that Lillian began experiencing the first mysterious health episodes that would become her daughter's signature. The symptoms would appear suddenly. Severe cramping in her stomach and intestines accompanied by nausea and diarrhea that would persist for several days before mysteriously disappearing. When these episodes occurred, Velma was always present to provide nursing care, bringing her mother special teas and broths that she claimed would help settle her stomach. Dr. William Stevenson, Lillian's physician for over 20 years, was puzzled by these recurring symptoms. Blood tests revealed nothing definitive, and the pattern of illness didn't match any standard diagnosis he was familiar with. The symptoms suggested some form of food poisoning or gastroenteritis, but Lillian wasn't eating anything unusual, and no other family members were affected when they shared meals with her. What Dr. Stevenson couldn't know was that Velma was conducting a careful experiment in dosage and timing. She had learned from Jennings's death that arsenic poisoning could mimic natural illness, but she needed to understand exactly how much poison would cause illness without death and how long the effects would last. Each episode with her mother was essentially a field test of different dosages and delivery methods. The psychological effect on Lillian was as important as the physical symptoms. Each bout of illness left her feeling weak and vulnerable, increasingly dependent on Velma's care and grateful for her daughter's constant attention. The fear of another episode made Lillian reluctant to question any of Velma's suggestions about household management or financial decisions. During this same period, Velma began dating another man, Robert Mackenzie, a local businessman who had lost his wife to cancer the previous year. Robert was attracted to Velma's apparent devotion to her family and her reputation as a caring daughter and mother. Their relationship progressed steadily through the summer of 1974, with Robert beginning to hint at marriage and a future together. But in August 1974, Robert Mackenzie died in a single-car accident on a rural highway outside Fayetteville. The circumstances were unusual. Robert was known as a careful driver who rarely traveled alone at night. Yet he had apparently lost control of his vehicle on a clear, dry road and crashed into a tree at high speed. No mechanical failure could be identified, and toxicology tests were not routinely performed on accident victims in that era. Robert's death was convenient for Velma in several ways. Their relationship had been progressing toward a level of intimacy and commitment that would have made her other activities more difficult to conceal. More importantly, Robert had been asking questions about her family's situation and finances that suggested he was becoming suspicious of certain inconsistencies in her stories. As Christmas approached in 1974, Velma knew that her mother's financial situation would soon be scrutinized by banks and insurance companies as part of their routine year-end audits. The amounts she had stolen were now substantial enough that discovery was inevitable unless she took decisive action to prevent any investigation. On the evening of December 28, 1974, during what should have been a peaceful holiday celebration with extended family, Lillian Bullard was struck by the most severe episode of stomach illness she had ever experienced. The pain was excruciating and constant, unlike the intermittent cramping of her previous episodes. The vomiting was violent and continuous, and she quickly became dehydrated and disoriented. Velma immediately took charge of the situation, calling for an ambulance and accompanying her mother to Cape Fear Valley Hospital. Throughout the crisis, she maintained the image of a devoted daughter, holding Lillian's hand during transport and staying by her bedside as medical personnel worked to stabilize her condition. Dr. Stevenson was called to the hospital to consult on Lillian's case, but he was as baffled as the emergency room physicians by the severity and progression of her symptoms. Blood work revealed significant abnormalities, but no specific cause could be identified. Intravenous fluids and anti-nausea medications provided temporary relief, but Lillian's overall condition continued to deteriorate. At 11:43 p.m. on December 30, 1974, Lillian Bullard died of what hospital records listed as complications from acute gastroenteritis. The attending physician noted that the case was unusual in its severity and rapid progression, but in an era before widespread awareness of poisoning cases, the possibility of deliberate harm was never seriously considered. Velma's grief at her mother's death appeared profound and genuine. She wept openly at the hospital, required sedation to sleep, and seemed completely devastated by the loss of the woman who had been her closest family member. The funeral was a major community event, with Lillian remembered as a devoted mother and grandmother who had raised 9 children and lived a life of Christian service. The settlement of Lillian's estate provided Velma with additional financial resources, but more importantly, it eliminated any possibility that her theft would be discovered. With her mother dead, there was no one to question missing funds or forged signatures, and the estate proceedings actually legitimized Velma's access to accounts she had been looting for months. But perhaps most significantly, Lillian's death had provided Velma with absolute confidence in her method. She had successfully murdered her own mother without arousing the slightest suspicion from medical professionals, family members, or law enforcement. The crime had been executed with clinical precision and had yielded exactly the results she had intended. A line that even the most hardened criminals rarely approach had been crossed by Velma. She had killed the woman who had given her life. If she could murder her own mother without detection or remorse, no one else would be safe from her calculated malice. By 1975, Velma's criminal activities had become increasingly sophisticated and bold, but they had also made her overconfident. The success of her previous murders had convinced her that she was virtually untouchable, a belief that led to carelessness in areas where she had previously been meticulous. Her check forgery operations, which had been conducted with careful attention to amounts and timing, became more aggressive and less discriminating. This overconfidence came to an abrupt end when she was arrested on 7 counts of writing bad checks, charges that carried serious felony penalties in North Carolina. The investigation revealed a pattern of financial crimes spanning multiple counties and involving numerous victims from small businesses to individual citizens who had trusted her with access to their accounts. The trial was a sobering experience for Velma. For the first time since she had begun her criminal career, she was facing serious consequences for her actions. The judge, noting the scope and deliberate nature of her crimes, sentenced her to 6 months in prison, a punishment that sent shock waves through the community that had continued to view her as an unfortunate widow struggling to survive. Prison should have been a wake-up call, an opportunity for Velma to confront her addictions and criminal behavior before they led to even more serious consequences. Instead, it became a graduate school for criminal activity. She was housed with other women who had committed financial crimes, and she learned new techniques for forgery, identity theft, and manipulation that made her previous methods seem amateurish by comparison. More dangerously, prison reinforced Velma's sense that she was smarter and more capable than the authorities who were supposed to catch criminals like her. She had committed 3 murders without arousing any suspicion, and even when she was caught stealing, the punishment was minimal. The lesson she drew from this experience was not that crime didn't pay, but that violent crime was much safer than financial crime because dead victims couldn't testify. When she was released after serving just 3 months of her sentence, Velma emerged with a new understanding of how vulnerable certain populations were to exploitation. During her incarceration, she had heard stories from other inmates about elderly victims who had been easy targets for financial scams, and she began to see the potential for combining her caregiving skills with her murderous impulses. In 1976, she found the perfect opportunity when she was hired as a home health aide for Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, an elderly couple in Lumberton. Montgomery was 94 years old, Dolly was 84, and both were wealthy enough to afford private care, but isolated enough to be vulnerable to systematic abuse. They had limited contact with extended family and few friends who visited regularly, making them ideal targets for someone with Velma's particular skills. The Edwards family was impressed by Velma's references and apparent devotion to her patients. She had carefully cultivated relationships with several churches in the area, presenting herself as a woman who had been forced into caregiving work by economic necessity, but who approached her duties with Christian dedication. Her request for Wednesday nights and Sundays off to attend religious services reinforced this image and provided her with alibis for times when she might need to be away from her victims. Montgomery and Dolly welcomed Velma into their home with the trust that characterized their generation's attitude toward caregivers. They gave her access to their financial records so she could help with bill paying, provided her with keys to their home and automobiles, and gradually became dependent on her for everything from medication management to meal preparation. What they didn't realize was that Velma had begun her standard pattern of theft almost immediately upon starting work. She studied their signatures, memorized their account numbers, and identified the patterns of their financial transactions with the expertise of a professional criminal. Within weeks, she was forging checks on Montgomery's accounts and making unauthorized withdrawals that she disguised as legitimate household expenses. The amounts she stole were substantial, but carefully calculated to avoid immediate detection. Montgomery's advancing age and increasing confusion made him an unreliable monitor of his own finances, and Dolly had never been involved in money management and didn't understand the family's financial situation well enough to notice discrepancies. For several months, this arrangement worked perfectly from Velma's perspective. She was being paid a legitimate salary for her caregiving work while simultaneously stealing far more than her wages through her forgery operations. The elderly couple trusted her completely and often expressed gratitude for her dedicated service, never suspecting that their trusted caregiver was systematically looting their life savings. Montgomery Edwards died on January 29, 1977, of what appeared to be natural causes related to his advanced age and failing health. His death was expected and peaceful, requiring no intervention from Velma beyond ensuring that he was comfortable during his final days. The family was grateful for her care during this difficult period and asked her to continue working for Dolly during her adjustment to widowhood. But just over a month later, on March 1, 1977, Dolly Edwards began experiencing symptoms that had become disturbingly familiar to anyone who had observed Velma's previous victims. The elderly woman, who had seemed to be coping well with her husband's death, suddenly developed severe cramping, nausea, and diarrhea that progressed rapidly from uncomfortable to life-threatening. Velma was by Dolly's side throughout the ordeal, demonstrating the same devoted care she had shown during Montgomery's final illness. She prepared special broths and teas for Dolly, claiming they would help settle her stomach, and stayed with her around the clock as her condition deteriorated. When it became clear that Dolly needed hospitalization, Velma rode in the ambulance and maintained her vigil at the hospital bedside. Despite medical intervention, Dolly's condition continued to worsen. The symptoms were consistent with severe gastroenteritis, but the rapid progression and intensity suggested something more serious than a simple stomach virus. On March 1, 1977, Dolly Edwards died with Velma holding her hand and whispering prayers for her peaceful passage. The Edwards family was devastated by the loss of both elderly relatives in such a short period, but they remained grateful for Velma's dedicated care during their family's difficult time. They spoke movingly at Dolly's funeral about how fortunate they had been to find such a caring Christian woman to help their loved ones during their final months. What they didn't know was that Velma had murdered Dolly Edwards to prevent the discovery of her ongoing theft. The elderly woman had begun asking questions about missing money and unexplained bank transactions that suggested she was becoming aware of the systematic looting of her accounts. Rather than risk exposure, Velma had chosen the permanent solution that had served her so well in the past. Following Dolly's death, Velma was quickly reassigned to care for another elderly couple, John Henry Lee, 80, and his wife Record Lee, who had recently broken her leg and needed assistance with daily activities. The Lee family had heard excellent references about Velma's caring nature and Christian character from the Edwards family, and they felt fortunate to secure her services during their time of need. John Henry Lee was a retired farmer who had worked hard throughout his life and saved enough money to ensure a comfortable retirement for himself and his wife. He was a proud, independent man who had initially resisted the idea of hiring outside help, but Record's injury and his own advancing age had made such assistance necessary. Velma quickly established herself as an indispensable part of the Lee household. She was particularly helpful with John Henry's medication management, as he was taking several prescriptions for various age-related ailments and sometimes became confused about dosages and timing. She also assisted with meal preparation, housekeeping, and the numerous small tasks that had become difficult for the elderly couple to manage independently. But as had become her pattern, Velma soon began studying the Lee family's financial situation and identifying opportunities for theft. John Henry was more alert and involved in money management than Montgomery Edwards had been, but he was still trusting enough to give Velma access to financial records when she offered to help with bill paying and correspondence. The theft from the Lee accounts was more challenging because John Henry maintained closer oversight of his finances, but Velma had learned to be patient and methodical in her approach. She would wait for opportunities when John Henry was distracted or confused, then forge small checks that could be explained as legitimate household expenses if questioned. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cumberland County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of small-town terror that proves evil can hide behind the most innocent face. On June 4, 1977, John Henry Lee began experiencing the now familiar symptoms that had claimed Velma's previous victims. The racking pains in his stomach and chest, accompanied by violent vomiting and diarrhea, struck suddenly during what had been a peaceful evening. The elderly man, who had been in relatively good health for his age, was suddenly writhing in agony as waves of pain washed over his frail body. Velma immediately assumed her role as the devoted caregiver, calling for medical assistance and staying by John Henry's side as his condition rapidly deteriorated. She prepared special teas and broths that she claimed would help ease his suffering, and she monitored his vital signs with the expertise of someone who had extensive experience with such medical crises. Dr. Marcus Webb, the Lee family physician, was called to examine John Henry both at home and later at the hospital when his condition became critical. The symptoms suggested severe gastroenteritis, possibly caused by food poisoning or a viral infection, but the rapid progression was unusual for a man who had been eating the same foods as his wife without ill effects. Despite aggressive medical treatment, including intravenous fluids, anti-nausea medications, and careful monitoring of his vital signs, John Henry Lee died within 48 hours of the onset of his symptoms. The official cause of death was listed as complications from acute gastroenteritis, a diagnosis that seemed reasonable given his age and the presentation of his illness. Record. Lee was devastated by her husband's sudden death, particularly since it had occurred just as she was beginning to recover from her own injury and they had been looking forward to many more years together. Velma was a source of tremendous comfort during this difficult period, helping with funeral arrangements and providing emotional support that the Lee family deeply appreciated. But once again, Velma had eliminated a victim who was becoming too observant about her financial activities. John Henry had begun asking pointed questions about certain bank transactions and missing funds that suggested he was developing suspicions about his trusted caregiver's honesty. His death removed this threat while reinforcing Velma's reputation as an unlucky woman who seemed to attract tragedy wherever she went. The pattern was now unmistakable to anyone who looked closely, but in rural North Carolina during the 1970s, the idea that a church-going grandmother might be systematically poisoning elderly patients was literally unthinkable. Each death was viewed as a separate tragedy, a natural consequence of advanced age and failing health, rather than as part of a deliberate pattern of murder for profit. Velma had perfected her method to such a degree that she was essentially operating with impunity. She had learned exactly how much arsenic to administer to produce symptoms that would appear natural, how to time the doses to avoid detection, and how to maintain her image as a devoted caregiver even while committing cold-blooded murder. She had become one of the most successful serial killers in American history, and no one suspected a thing. By late 1977, Velma had entered into what would become her most significant and ultimately fatal relationship with Stuart Taylor, a 56-year-old tobacco farmer and widower who represented a different type of target than her previous victims. Unlike the elderly patients she had been systematically murdering, Stuart was relatively young, healthy, and alert. He also had limited financial resources, which meant that money was not the primary motive for their relationship. Stuart Taylor was a simple, honest man who had worked the same tobacco farm for most of his adult life. He had been married for over 30 years when his wife died of cancer, leaving him lonely and somewhat lost in managing the domestic aspects of his life. He was not particularly religious, but he understood that faith was important to many people in their community, and he respected those who found comfort in church attendance. Their relationship began when Stuart was introduced to Velma through the Edwards family, who spoke highly of her character and caregiving abilities. Stuart was attracted to Velma's apparent stability and domestic skills, qualities that seemed to promise the kind of companionship he had been missing since his wife's death. She was an excellent cook, maintained an immaculate household, and demonstrated the kind of moral values that he associated with good character. For Velma, the relationship with Stuart represented something different from her previous associations. He was not wealthy enough to be worth murdering for financial gain, and he was too alert and involved in his own affairs to be an easy target for systematic theft. Instead, their relationship provided her with emotional stability and a cover of normalcy that helped deflect any lingering suspicions about the recent string of deaths among her patients. The couple settled into a comfortable routine that seemed to benefit both of them. Stuart appreciated having someone to cook his meals, manage his household, and provide companionship during the long winter evenings. Velma enjoyed the security of a stable relationship and the respectability that came from being associated with a man who was well regarded in the farming community. But beneath this veneer of domestic tranquility, Velma continued her drug addiction and the financial crimes necessary to support it. She had been taking prescription medications for so many years that her tolerance required increasingly large doses to achieve the desired effects. The cost of maintaining her habit far exceeded what her legitimate income could support, forcing her to resume the check forgery activities that had previously landed her in prison. Stuart's bank accounts became her new target, though she was more careful this time to avoid the mistakes that had led to her previous arrest. She studied his signature until she could reproduce it perfectly, memorized his account numbers and typical transaction patterns, and began writing forged checks for amounts that would not immediately trigger bank scrutiny. For several months, this system worked effectively. Stuart was a trusting man who rarely examined his bank statements closely, and when he did notice discrepancies, Velma was always ready with reasonable explanations about household expenses or business costs that he might have forgotten. Her tears and apparent distress at being questioned were particularly effective at ending such conversations before they could develop into serious investigations. The situation began to unravel in late January 1978 when Stuart's banker, Harold Patterson, noticed irregular patterns in his account activity during a routine review. Patterson had known Stuart for decades and was familiar with his conservative spending habits. So the recent increase in check-writing activity struck him as unusual enough to warrant inquiry. During a casual conversation at the local feed store, Patterson mentioned some of the larger transactions to Stuart, asking if he was planning any major purchases or improvements to his property. This innocent inquiry revealed that Stewart had no knowledge of several significant withdrawals, setting in motion the investigation that would ultimately expose Velma's crimes. Stewart confronted Velma on the evening of January 31, 1978, with documentary evidence of her forgeries that Patterson had helped him compile. The confrontation was more intense than any argument they had previously had, with Stewart demanding complete disclosure of her financial activities and threatening to involve law enforcement if she couldn't provide satisfactory explanations. The argument escalated quickly, with Stewart becoming increasingly angry as the scope of Velma's deception became clear. In a moment of rage, he grabbed Velma by the shoulders and shook her, shouting that she had betrayed his trust and destroyed their relationship. This physical confrontation, while brief and relatively mild, represented a line that Stewart had never crossed before and that Velma interpreted as a direct threat to her safety. For a woman who had murdered her own mother without hesitation, eliminating a boyfriend who had discovered her crimes was almost automatic. Stewart had become a threat that needed to be neutralized, and Velma had a proven method for dealing with such problems permanently. That evening, despite the tension from their earlier confrontation, Stewart and Velma attended a Pentecostal revival meeting featuring the famous preacher Rex Humbard at the Cumberland County Civic Center in Fayetteville. Stewart had agreed to accompany her despite their fight, partly because he wanted to work through their problems and partly because he knew how important such events were to her spiritual life. They were both dressed in their Sunday best for the occasion, presenting the appearance of a normal couple attending a religious service. Other attendees who knew them noted that they seemed somewhat subdued, but attributed this to the serious nature of the revival atmosphere rather than to any personal difficulties they might be experiencing. As the revival service began, Stewart started experiencing severe nausea and stomach pain that came on suddenly and intensely. The symptoms were initially subtle, a slight queasiness that he attributed to nerves from their earlier argument, but they quickly escalated to debilitating levels that forced him to leave his seat and seek relief in the restroom. Velma was immediately attentive and concerned, following him to check on his condition and offering to take him home if he was feeling unwell. Other congregation members noticed her obvious devotion to him during his distress, commenting later about what a caring partner she was during his medical crisis. When Stewart's condition failed to improve during the service, Velma insisted on taking him home and putting him to bed, promising to monitor his symptoms and call a doctor if necessary. The drive home was agonizing for Stewart, who was now experiencing waves of cramping pain that left him doubled over and struggling to breathe normally. Over the next 3 days, Stewart's condition deteriorated steadily despite Velma's devoted nursing care. The stomach pain became excruciating and constant, accompanied by violent vomiting that prevented him from keeping down even small amounts of water. He also began experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing that suggested his cardiovascular system was being affected by whatever was causing his illness. Velma prepared special teas and broths for Stewart, claiming they would help settle his stomach and restore his strength. She monitored his vital signs constantly, adjusting his position to make him more comfortable and providing emotional support during his moments of greatest distress. To observers, she appeared to be doing everything possible to help him recover from what seemed to be a severe case of food poisoning or stomach flu. When Stewart's condition became life-threatening, Velma made the decision to take him to the hospital, where emergency room physicians worked to stabilize his condition through intravenous fluids and medications designed to control his symptoms. Despite their efforts, Stewart continued to decline, showing signs of multiple organ failure that suggested systemic poisoning. On February 3, 1978, Stewart Taylor died at Cape Fear Valley Hospital with Velma maintaining her vigil at his bedside. The attending physician initially diagnosed his death as complications from acute gastroenteritis, following the same pattern that had been established with Velma's previous victims. But this time, something was fundamentally different. Stewart's relatives, particularly those who knew about his recent discovery of Velma's financial crimes, were deeply suspicious of the timing and circumstances of his death. Unlike the elderly victims whose deaths had been attributed to natural causes, Stewart had been relatively young and healthy, making his sudden illness and rapid decline much more difficult to explain as a natural occurrence. The family's demands for a complete autopsy represented the first serious challenge to Velma's method. For nearly a decade, she had been able to murder with impunity because her victims' deaths had been accepted as natural or accidental. But Stewart's family refused to accept the initial medical diagnosis and insisted on thorough toxicological testing that would reveal the true cause of his death. Even before the autopsy results were available, the investigation began to unravel Velma's carefully constructed facade. Her own sister, who had been harboring growing suspicions about the pattern of deaths surrounding Velma, contacted the Lumberton police with information that would change everything. In a tearful phone call that would later be described as one of the most dramatic moments in Cumberland County law enforcement history, Velma's sister told investigators that she believed her sibling had poisoned Stewart Taylor and possibly other victims. The call came from a woman who was torn between family loyalty and moral obligation, someone who could no longer remain silent about her terrible suspicions. When the autopsy results confirmed the presence of lethal levels of arsenic in Stewart Taylor's system, police finally had the evidence they needed to arrest the woman who had been hiding in plain sight as one of North Carolina's most prolific serial killers. The arrest of Velma Barfield on March 28, 1978, sent shock waves through the rural communities of Cumberland and Robeson counties where she had operated for nearly a decade. The woman who had been viewed as an unlucky widow, a devoted daughter, and a caring grandmother was suddenly revealed to be a calculating serial killer who had used arsenic-based rat poison to systematically eliminate anyone who threatened her financial security or discovered her crimes. Under interrogation by experienced detectives from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Velma's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Faced with irrefutable physical evidence of Stewart Taylor's arsenic poisoning and mounting circumstantial evidence linking her to other suspicious deaths, she began to confess to crimes that shocked even veteran law enforcement officers. In a series of statements that were recorded and later used as evidence in her trial, Velma admitted to poisoning Stewart Taylor, her elderly mother, Lillian Bullard, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee. Her confessions were delivered in a matter-of-fact tone that investigators found more chilling than any emotional display of remorse might have been. She described her methods with clinical precision, explaining how she had calculated dosages, timed administrations, and monitored symptoms to achieve the desired results. According to her statements, Velma claimed that she had never intended to kill any of her victims. She insisted that her goal had been merely to make them sick enough to buy time to replace money she had stolen from their accounts. Each death, she maintained, was an accidental overdose resulting from her inexperience with the poison rather than deliberate murder. This explanation was met with profound skepticism by investigators who had uncovered evidence of careful planning and premeditation in each case. The pattern of theft followed by poisoning was too consistent to be coincidental, and the precise timing of each attack suggested someone with extensive knowledge of how arsenic poisoning progressed from illness to death. The investigation expanded rapidly as authorities began exhuming bodies and conducting toxicological tests on other individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances in Velma's presence. The body of Jennings Barfield, her second husband, was exhumed from his grave in Cumberland County and found to contain significant levels of arsenic, confirming investigators' suspicions about his death in 1971. Despite this evidence, Velma continued to deny involvement in Jennings's death, just as she steadfastly refused to admit to killing her first husband, Thomas Burke, in the house fire of 1969. Even when confronted with the statistical impossibility of so many deaths occurring naturally around one person, she maintained her innocence regarding these earlier crimes. The case attracted national media attention as details of Velma's crimes became public. The image of a grandmother systematically poisoning elderly patients and family members challenged fundamental assumptions about who could be capable of serial murder. News outlets struggled to reconcile the sweet-faced woman in church photographs with the calculating killer described in police reports. Her trial began on November 27, 1978, in Bladen County Superior Court, with the case having been moved from Robeson County due to extensive pretrial publicity. The proceeding was presided over by Judge Henry A. McKinnon, one of North Carolina's most experienced and respected trial judges, who had handled numerous capital cases throughout his distinguished career. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Joe Freeman Britt, presented a methodical case that traced the pattern of theft and murder from Thomas Burke's death in 1969 through Stewart Taylor's poisoning in 1978. They introduced evidence of Velma's systematic check forgery operations, her access to each victim's financial resources, and the timing of each death in relation to the discovery or potential discovery of her crimes. Particularly damaging was testimony about Velma's behavior during and after each victim's illness. Witnesses described how she had insisted on preparing special foods and drinks for her victims, how she had monitored their symptoms with unusual interest, and how she had seemed almost eager to volunteer information about their medical conditions to physicians and family members. The defense team, led by attorneys Robert Jacobson and Richard Burr, faced an almost impossible task in light of the physical evidence and Velma's own confessions. They attempted to argue that her judgment had been impaired by her extensive use of prescription drugs, claiming that she had been too intoxicated to form the intent necessary for first-degree murder. They also introduced testimony about Velma's difficult childhood and alleged history of sexual abuse, hoping to generate sympathy from the jury and provide psychological explanations for her criminal behavior. Dr. Dorothy Otno Lewis, a prominent psychiatrist from New York University, testified that Velma suffered from dissociative identity disorder and claimed to have spoken with an alternate personality named Tiny, who had supposedly committed the murders. This psychiatric testimony was met with skepticism by both the judge and jury. Judge McKinnon famously responded to the multiple personality defense by stating, "One of them did it. I don't care which one," making clear his view that the legal system was concerned with actions rather than psychological theories about motivation. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder in Stuart Taylor's death. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and their conviction that Velma had deliberately planned and executed Taylor's murder. During the sentencing phase of the trial, the same jury was asked to determine whether Velma should receive life imprisonment or the death penalty. The prosecution argued for three aggravating circumstances: that the murder had been committed for pecuniary gain, that it had been committed to hinder law enforcement, and that it had been especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The defense presented evidence of Velma's drug addiction, her history of mental health problems, and her role as a mother and grandmother in an effort to establish mitigating factors that might save her from execution. They argued that her crimes were the result of desperation and addiction rather than inherent evil, and that she deserved the opportunity for rehabilitation rather than death. After considering all the evidence and arguments, the jury found that the aggravating circumstances outweighed any mitigating factors and recommended that Velma be sentenced to death. On December 2, 1978, Judge McKinnon formally sentenced her to death by asphyxiation in North Carolina's gas chamber, making her one of the few women on death row in the United States. The appeals process that followed lasted 6 years and involved numerous legal challenges based on claims of ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and constitutional violations. Velma's attorneys filed appeals with the North Carolina Supreme Court, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and ultimately sought review by the United States Supreme Court. During her time on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, Velma underwent what appeared to be a genuine religious conversion. She began leading Bible studies for other female inmates, counseling troubled prisoners, and corresponding with Christian leaders throughout the country. Her transformation was so notable that prominent evangelicals, including Billy and Ruth Graham, became advocates for commuting her sentence to life imprisonment. The campaign to save Velma's life gained international attention and generated thousands of letters to North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt requesting clemency. Supporters argued that her religious conversion demonstrated genuine remorse and that executing a grandmother would set a dangerous precedent for the treatment of women in the criminal justice system. However, the families of her victims remained adamant that justice required her execution. They pointed out that Velma had shown no remorse for her crimes until after her conviction and that her religious conversion seemed calculated to generate sympathy rather than representing genuine spiritual transformation. Governor Hunt ultimately denied all requests for clemency, stating that the severity of Velma's crimes and the calculated nature of her actions made her case inappropriate for executive intervention. In a final act of acceptance, Velma instructed her attorneys to abandon their pending appeal to the United States Supreme Court, stating that she wanted to die with dignity rather than continue prolonging the legal process. On November 2, 1984, at 2:15 a.m., Margie Velma Barfield became the first woman executed by lethal injection in United States history. She was also the first woman executed in the United States since 1962 and the first woman executed in North Carolina since 1944. Her execution marked the end of a criminal career that had spanned 15 years and claimed at least 6 confirmed victims. Her final statement, delivered just before the lethal injection was administered, was characteristically brief and focused on the pain she had caused others. "I know that everybody has gone through a lot of pain. All the families connected, and I am sorry. And I want to thank everybody who have been supporting me all these 6 years." Her last meal request of cheese doodles and Coca-Cola struck many observers as oddly childlike for someone who had committed such sophisticated crimes, perhaps reflecting the disconnect between her public image as a simple grandmother and the reality of her calculating criminal mind. Velma was buried in a small rural North Carolina cemetery near her first husband, Thomas Burke. The man whose death had begun her decade-long killing spree and whose burning body had taught her that murder could solve problems while generating financial reward and sympathy. The case of Velma Barfield fundamentally changed how law enforcement and medical professionals approached unexplained deaths among vulnerable populations. Her crimes demonstrated how predators could exploit society's trust in caregivers and family members, using their positions of authority and access to commit horrific acts while maintaining facades of respectability and devotion. The investigation also revealed significant gaps in the systems designed to protect elderly and dependent individuals from abuse: the lack of coordination between medical examiners, the absence of routine toxicological testing, and the general reluctance to suspect foul play in deaths among elderly patients had created an environment where a serial killer could operate with virtual impunity for nearly a decade. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Velma's crimes might represent only the tip of the iceberg. Investigators suspected that she might have been responsible for additional deaths that could never be proven due to lack of physical evidence or witnesses. The true scope of her criminal career may never be known, as many of her potential victims were cremated or buried before the pattern of poisoning was recognized. This mystery shows us how evil can hide behind the most innocent and trusted faces in our communities, appearing as the helpful neighbor, the devoted daughter, the caring grandmother who volunteers at church and never misses a school function. Velma Barfield's story serves as a chilling reminder that predators often wear masks of respectability and that the most dangerous criminals may be those we least suspect. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Velma Barfield's crimes, or could there have been other victims who were never discovered? Leave your comment below with your theories about this case, and let us know if you think there might have been additional murders that authorities never connected to her. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The darkness of human nature has many more secrets to reveal, and we'll be here to uncover them together. See you in the next video.